Burkina Faso has spent more than a decade battling a growing militant insurgency that has displaced millions, destabilized rural communities, and crippled agricultural production. Vast areas of farmland were abandoned as insecurity spread, villages emptied, and food supply chains collapsed. By the time Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power in 2022, the country was facing not only a security emergency but a food and economic crisis that threatened national survival. Traoré emerged at a time when public trust in traditional counter-terrorism strategies had eroded. Years of reliance on foreign military assistance, private security contractors, and externally designed stabilization programs had produced limited results. Militants continued to expand their reach, while rural poverty deepened and youth unemployment surged. Many young men, cut off from livelihoods, were drawn into armed groups or informal militias simply to survive. One of the most radical shifts under Traoré's leadership was the reframing of security itself. Instead of treating militancy as purely a military problem, his administration began linking security directly to land, food, and employment. The logic was simple but controversial. Guns alone cannot defeat instability if hunger, joblessness, and social exclusion remain unresolved. By late 2023, Burkina Faso launched an ambitious program that combined military victories with mass reintegration. Following intensified operations that weakened militant groups in several regions, authorities announced that approximately 8,000 former fighters and militia members would be diverted into structured agricultural work. The move shocked observers both inside and outside Africa. The fighters were not simply released or abandoned. Many were absorbed into state-supervised agricultural brigades operating in reclaimed rural zones. These zones had previously been inaccessible due to militant activity. With security forces establishing perimeters, farming resumed under protection, allowing displaced communities to return. The program targeted key crops essential for national food security, including maize, millet, rice, and sorghum. Burkina Faso had long depended on food imports and humanitarian aid due to falling domestic production. By mobilizing labor at scale, the government aimed to reverse this dependency and stabilize prices. The initiative also addressed another urgent issue: what to do with thousands of young men trained in violence once the fighting subsides. Leaving them unemployed risked renewed conflict. Absorbing them into productive labor offered a pathway toward long-term stability, while reinforcing state authority in rural areas. Supporters of the policy argue that it reflects African realities more accurately than imported counter-terrorism models. In many rural regions, farming is not just an economic activity but a social anchor. Reconnecting former fighters to land, family networks, and food production reduces incentives to return to armed groups. Critics, however, raised concerns. Some questioned whether former militants could be trusted or whether communities traumatized by violence would accept them. Others worried about human rights oversight and the possibility of coercion. The Traore government insisted participation was voluntary and framed the initiative as rehabilitation rather than punishment. What distinguished the policy was its scale. Reintegration programs elsewhere often involve hundreds. Burkina Faso's involved thousands at once. This reflected the depth of the crisis but also the urgency of restoring agricultural capacity before long-term famine risks emerged. The agricultural push was accompanied by broader reforms. The state increased investment in irrigation, distributed farming equipment, and expanded state-owned grain reserves. Military engineers were deployed to repair rural roads, enabling harvested crops to reach markets. The message was clear: security gains would be immediately translated into economic recovery. International reactions were mixed. Some Western governments expressed caution, emphasizing conventional demobilization standards. Others quietly acknowledged that Burkina Faso was experimenting with a model shaped by local conditions rather than donor templates. Within Africa, the move was closely watched by countries facing similar insurgencies. Traoré's leadership style amplified the impact. As a young military officer who rose rapidly, he cultivated an image of urgency and directness. His speeches frequently linked sovereignty to food independence, arguing that no nation could be truly secure while relying on external aid to feed its population. The policy also aligned with broader shifts across the Sahel, where governments have increasingly emphasized self-reliance, national control of resources, and reduced dependence on foreign military forces. Agriculture, long neglected in security discussions, became central to this vision. By early 2024, reports from reclaimed farming zones indicated rising production. While independent verification remained limited due to security conditions, domestic grain markets began showing signs of stabilization. Local leaders reported improved access to food and reduced recruitment into armed groups. The reintegration strategy also carried symbolic weight. Transforming fighters into farmers sent a powerful message that the state could offer alternatives to violence. It reframed masculinity and heroism away from armed struggle toward nation building through labor. This approach echoed historical precedents. Post-conflict societies across the world have often turned to large-scale public works and agriculture to absorb former combatants. What made Burkina Faso's case distinctive was the speed, scale, and explicit linkage between counterinsurgency and food security. Traoré's government faced immense pressure. Any failure risked renewed instability and international criticism. Yet the administration appeared willing to accept that risk, betting that bold action was preferable to stagnation. The program also intersected with youth demographics. Burkina Faso has one of the youngest populations in the world. Without employment pathways, instability would remain cyclical. Agriculture, despite being undervalued globally, remains the sector with the greatest capacity to absorb labor quickly. The long-term success of the initiative will depend on sustainability. Land access, market integration, climate resilience, and continued security are all critical. Climate change poses additional challenges, with erratic rainfall threatening yields. The government has signaled plans to expand irrigation and drought-resistant crops. Regional implications are significant. If successful, Burkina Faso's model could influence policy across the Sahel and beyond. Countries facing insurgency may reconsider purely military approaches and integrate economic reintegration more aggressively. For supporters of Traoré, the policy represents a reclaiming of agency. Decisions are framed as being made in Ouagadougou rather than foreign capitals. The emphasis on farming reflects a return to foundational economic activities rather than reliance on extractive industries alone. Opponents remain skeptical. They argue that structural reforms, political inclusion, and reconciliation are equally necessary. Agriculture alone cannot resolve deep grievances. Yet even critics acknowledge that ignoring livelihoods has historically undermined peace efforts. What is undeniable is that Burkina Faso has altered the conversation. Militants defeated on the battlefield are not simply removed from society but redirected into rebuilding it. Fields that once lay empty due to fear are being cultivated again. The transformation from fighter to farmer is not symbolic alone. It reshapes daily routines, social identities, and future expectations. Harvest cycles replace combat cycles. Productivity replaces destruction. As Burkina Faso continues its experiment, the world watches. In a region often portrayed only through conflict, this strategy highlights an alternative narrative focused on labor, land, and food. The coming years will test whether this approach can endure beyond emergency conditions. But for now, it stands as one of the most unconventional responses to insurgency in recent African history. In choosing farms over prisons and fields over perpetual war, Burkina Faso has taken a gamble rooted in the belief that stability grows from the soil up. Whether that gamble reshapes the future of the Sahel remains one of the most important questions facing the region today.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.